World War I was described as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. In this, it failed, as we'll see in some detail in this lecture. The hopes of an entire continent were largely extinguished by the rise of dictatorships of the right or of the left. Hopes of peace were also compromised by the failure of the great powers to confront and suppress the growing threat of renewed militarism. Peace had been purchased at so high a price that most Europeans after World War I felt an obligation to protect the next generation from the horrors that they had witnessed. The suffering, the loss of life, the almost incredible destruction of entire cities and thousands of square miles of farmland all testified to the responsibility of Europeans to ensure that destruction on this level would never happen again. Entire empires had been destroyed: the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the German. Families that had ruled for centuries, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, and the Romanovs, were now exiled from their homelands, and in the case of the Romanovs of Russia, dead. The traditional political systems were in disarray. Once proud militaries were reduced to rebellious, starving, and desperate bands of deserters, and great nations had been humiliated or brought to the brink of anarchy. From this chaos and cataclysm, Europe had been promised a new dawn of representative government, national self-determination, and democracy. And all of these had been expressed so clearly in President Wilson's 14 points. Militarism was to be at an end, and the ambitions and dreams of entire peoples were at last to be realized through the action of peaceful politics and an equitable economic system in which the wealth of their nations would be more fairly distributed. This was the dream. But in Europe, between the wars, it became a nightmare. We have seen how the two great empires of Germany and Russia were transformed into totalitarian dictatorships of the most horrible kind, one Nazi and one communist. Both of these monstrous dictatorships tortured and enslaved their own populations and then turned against their neighbors to inflict even more human carnage and suffering. But Germany and the Soviet Union were not alone. Most of Europe descended into dictatorships of one kind or another, of the right or the left, taking the ideologies of the 19th century and applying them in ways that negated any possible belief in progress or any optimism that the human condition was being improved. Did it need to happen? Was the chaos and suffering of the states of Europe between the wars the necessary consequence of the failed statesmanship of Versailles or the other treaties that ended that great war? Could the optimism that emerged in 1918 in so many places ever have been fulfilled? Or were the 19th century ideals of liberalism, science, progress, and democracy doomed by more sinister forces of nationalism, racial theory, imperialism, social Darwinism, and a renewed militarism? Almost all of the new states and former powers that emerged from the Versailles Treaty began as liberal democracies. But by 1939, among the great powers, only Britain, France, and the United States could be described as enjoying democratic government. Italy, Germany, and Spain were fascist. Hungary was fascist in all but name, dominated by a landowning gentry and a regent dictator, Admiral Miklos Horthy, and allied with Germany. Romania, too, was a fascist puppet. Poland, Turkey, China, and Japan were military dictatorships. Russia was a totalitarian communist dictatorship. And by 1939, Austria and Czechoslovakia had even ceased to exist. The reason for the collapse of democracy so quickly after the war varied from country to country, but there are a few common factors we have to note. First, class conflict increased. The poor and the working classes had suffered the most during the war. They're the ones who had been sent to the front lines and were slaughtered by the millions. At home, their wives, daughters, and mothers had worked in factories, in munition plants, in transportation, in order to support the war effort. As a result of these sacrifices, the working classes truly expected a fairer share of the reconstituted economic world, believing that they had paid for peaceful, comfortable lives with their blood. However, when the civilian governments returned, the lower classes found they were in the same plight. Indeed, many were in much worse positions than they had been in 1914. Large numbers of war wounded, millions of men, could never return to their former lives, and their pensions were small, while those who did return from the front whole and healthy faced food shortages, unemployment, and a lack of consumer goods. Moreover, there had been the successful Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and briefly in Hungary, and there had been an attempted communist revolution that came close to success in Germany in 1919. As a result, the propertied and middle classes and the old elites became even more conservative, especially given the fragility of European states between the wars. They slipped back into that early 19th century opinion of classe laborieuse, classe dangereuse, and drew their political and economic wagons into a tight circle to protect their property and their positions from communism, as we saw it as such dangerous effect in Weimar Germany and Mussolini's Italy. Furthermore, the economic conditions in Europe after the war were appalling in almost every state, whether victorious or vanquished. For example, the new nations created out of what had been large empires suffered from competition from older, better established states. These enjoyed efficient policies and experienced managers able to reconnect with old markets and suppliers. Former composite empires had functioned very well indeed when governed by a singular, centralized imperial economic policy. But when these empires were fragmented, the successor states couldn't reestablish the links that had helped them prosper before the war. When Austria-Hungary had existed, its economy was growing and thriving. It relied upon the interdependence of its various parts to make the whole run effectively. Hungary had been the agricultural heartland. Austria, Bohemia, and Poland the industrial centers, with free trade linking the regions. And the ports on the Adriatic gave the Habsburg Empire access to the markets and raw materials of the world. But when the empire was divided, the new nations born from it, eager to protect their nascent economies, established high tariff barriers, competing for a share of the European market. The agricultural states, like Hungary, had not enough industry. The industrial states, like Austria, had insufficient agriculture, with 1/3 of its population in just one city, the old capital of Vienna. Once integrated transportation links were severed, landlocked states like Austria and Hungary lacked access to the sea, while the great port cities of the former empire were reduced to irrelevance by their new allegiances. Trieste, for example, had been the great port of the Austrian Empire, but once it passed to Italy, a kingdom already rich in Adriatic ports like nearby Venice, it really served no purpose and began a serious decline. Also, the reparations to be paid by the Germans caused hyperinflation, exacerbated by the printing of money not just in Germany, but also by the new states, which had to build a state apparatus from nothing at all. States that had not existed before needed to build from a base of zero everything from the creation of a national government to the creation of a national army. And these are extremely expensive occupations. And every new state required these elements of sovereignty immediately. Because they had now existed, and also because of the fragility of the European situation, they needed defense. They needed armies, they needed military materiel, and they also needed diplomatic services and civil services to run the bureaucracies that would provide some measure of comfort and security to their populations. There was also the cost of rebuilding the shattered countries of France and Belgium, where most of the fighting had taken place. German reparations were, of course, initially planned to carry most of this burden, but the payments didn't begin immediately, and the inflation of the 1920s made any single source of reconstruction impossible. France still carried its debt from the war, and Belgium had been thoroughly damaged. The result was that inflation that we talked about previously that made European currencies unstable, and the economic situation in Germany desperate because of the reparations payment. Money lost value across the continent. Those we've seen, it became essentially in Germany where it was absolutely worthless. The poor burned paper bills to fuel their homes, so worthless was the paper money circulating in the streets. Many states teetered under the pressure of economic crisis. The religion of nationalism, moreover, hadn't been weakened by the war, but rather, curiously and tragically, it had been strengthened. Many of the new states had hostile minorities working from within to destroy them, or groups from without who strove to reconstitute the borders of 1914. The Germans in Czechoslovakia, the Hungarians in Romania, the Germans in Poland, the Italians in Yugoslavia. These people had no wish whatsoever to live in these new countries. and they served as willing accomplices to acts of treason in favor of union with their fellow nationals, or they disrupted the political discourse to a degree that compromise became impossible, and in some instances, the office of government itself broke down. This lack of unity was made much worse by inexperienced or inept statesmen thrown into power in 1919. Simply put, the condition of Europe between the wars then was dangerous. Many new states identified national heroes as heads of government or heads of state. These were men, as I suggested, with little or no political experience or even much aptitude for government. But they'd been thrown into the most dangerous and complex period that the continent had known since perhaps the collapse of the Roman Empire. In exile or in opposition before the war, many of these statesmen were living in the past, fighting old battles with non-existent enemies, because these were the battles they knew. The inflation, the nationalism, the economic collapse, and the seething hatred of interwar Europe were all elements beyond their experience, and they were unable to cope. The events following the war in Hungary illustrated exactly how dangerous the situation had become and how fragile the states created after the war proved to be. In particular, the situation in Hungary provided evidence of the dangers of Bolshevik revolution and nationalist fury. Attempts to liberalize the Kingdom of Hungary through needed land reforms and more open government were undone by nationalism and the treaty imposed after the war. The government, in fact, in the last years of the war, and the government that was expected to take control once the new state of Hungary was created, was committed to the idea of breaking up the huge estates and to distributing this land to the peasants who work them. The aristocrat who was in charge of this government, Count Karolyi, actually gave up his own estates as an example to others. And there was great hope that Hungary, in fact, might become a modern nation. But there were problems that couldn't be overcome. And despite President Wilson's public posturing, the issue of nationalism wasn't settled in any coherent way. And to some extent, Hungary lost the most. The Hungarians, when faced with the Treaty at Trianon, simply were as appalled as the Germans when faced with the Treaty of Versailles. The Hungarians lost Slovakia, which was united with the Czech lands to form the new Republic of Czechoslovakia. The Hungarians lost Transylvania, which was ceded to Romania, despite the fact that it had a huge Hungarian population. 25% of the population of Transylvania was Hungarian-speaking and of Hungarian nationality. Also, both of these territories had ancient historic ties to the Hungarian kingdom. They were part of the national collective unconscious of the Hungarians, and to lose them was to some extent losing part of their historical DNA, and they were angry. And as in Germany, the unfairness and the harshness of the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary resulted in the liberal regime resigning in protest, that regime that had promised such hope and was so well led and so well intentioned. This resignation weakened the best hope for the emergence of a stable democratic state. Bitter and disillusioned by the failure of promised land reform by that liberal government, together with the humiliation imposed on Hungary by the victors, Hungarian peasants and urban workers, stirred up by politicized prisoners of war and incited by Lenin's propaganda, agitated for a Bolshevik solution. Led by Bela Kun, an agent of Lenin, a coup against the government in March of 1919 led to the creation of the Hungarian Soviet Republic from March to August of 1919. Once in power, Kun imposed a Soviet-model revolutionary government using the same tactics of terror that had been employed by the Bolsheviks in Russia. It appeared certain that Hungary had become another Bolshevik state, but this time not one on the margins of Europe, but one in the very center of the continent itself. This was something the victorious powers and Hungary's frightened neighbors couldn't permit, a Leninist government in Central Europe. Consequently, Romania, the neighbor to the south, encouraged by France and Britain, ordered its army to suppress the revolt, exiling Bela Kun to Russia. It occupied Hungary, in fact, until 1920, until Admiral Miklos Horthy assumed control as dictator. Oddly, the monarchy in Hungary was even restored, but with no king, just as Horthy was an admiral with no fleet in a landlocked nation. Horthy's right-wing government soon turned against the leftist supporters of Kun, arresting, imprisoning, or even killing those with known ties to the Bolsheviks. Also, with very, very sinister implications for the ensuing decades, Bela Kun was a Jew. This led to the sharp rise of anti-Semitism in Hungary, which associated, as did the Nazis and so many other right-wing ideologues, communism and Judaism. They pointed to Trotsky, they pointed to Karl Marx himself, and the argument was that there was a connection, and so consequently the racial theory that was beginning to percolate throughout the entire continent was associating itself with anti-communism. The result was, in Hungary, anti-Jewish legislation was imposed independently of Hitler. The anti-Jewish laws in Hungary had nothing whatsoever to do with the Nazis. These were not imposed by the Germans. These were imposed by the Hungarians themselves. Another example of a nation tormenting its own law-abiding and productive citizens because of a set of perverted ideas. More chilling, the anti-Jewish ordinances also contained a rehearsal of the old arguments of racial purity, racial cleansing, and the search for a scapegoat. We have to remember that, terrible as the events were in Germany, that they weren't unique. These things happened elsewhere, independently as well. Hitler was a monster, but there were other monsters circulating through the continent after the war. Although, as I said, World War I was promised to be a war to preserve democracy in Europe, the results were not as hoped, even in those states where democratic institutions existed and operated. Indeed, democracy in Europe between the wars seemed to promise only more divisions, more insecurities, failure. As a result, many Europeans sought saviors who would give them a purpose, who would impose order where they saw none. Where they saw confusion, they were looking for clarity. Where they saw division, they were looking for order and strength. Furthermore, liberal democracy had no lengthy tradition, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, or for that matter, even in Italy, as we've seen, because the Italians didn't have manhood suffrage until 1912. President Wilson had seen the whole world as an imperfect vision of the United States. And this is where he failed as a statesman, unable to accept the realities of composite European states rather than the nationalist dreams of self-determination expressed by exiles and demagogues. But he was hardly alone. And he shouldn't be judged too harshly. Other statesmen in Europe made exactly the same error in identifying democracy as the panacea to all the problems faced by all of their nations. The belief was simply give these people an opportunity to express themselves in nation states and all will be well. Allow them to solve their own problems. Take away the overreaching power of imperial governments and emperors and everything will become clear. Not only was it naive and simplistic, it was wrong. Weimar Germany, for example, has been called so often a republic with no Republicans. Few in the political classes wanted an end to the state that Bismarck had crafted in 1871. They remembered it with nostalgia and affection, and they wanted it back. Ebert proclaimed a republic for immediate political advantage. He believed that by taking out all of the anger on the House of Hohenzollern and the Empire, that in fact there would be some measure of security provided for the state, that the anger could be directed to someone who was already gone, that is the old emperor, and to a state that no longer existed. In so doing, his belief was the threat of a Bolshevik revolution might be countered by Germans, who would then rally to a pluralistic republic and see that this new republic reflected the wide perspective that really was reflective of the German people themselves. But it didn't happen. And we have to remember Germany, although hardly democratic, had at least enjoyed a vibrant political life before 1914. Enjoyed manhood suffrage, enjoyed an efficient bureaucracy, and in fact, every aspect of a successful state. So if Germany were to fail in this regard, if democracy and republicanism have failed in Germany, why would anyone believe that it would work in the new states, states that had not existed for centuries or that had never existed? New states like Hungary and Poland had no such experience, no such advantage, no vibrant political life from before the war. They were part of composite empires in very complex situations that they themselves could not altogether manage. They were accustomed to a kind of benevolent paternal autocracy. like that under Franz Joseph or the Romanov Tsars. Once faced with the rigors and the attendant risks of democracy and political life, these new states fell to dictatorships, or they were annexed by more powerful, aggressive neighbors who had clearly no respect for democracy or self-determination. Austria, after a difficult experiment with republican democracy, ultimately yielded almost gratefully to Hitler in the Anschluss. Austria, though, had developed its own Nazi party and, in fact, had powerfully agitated amongst many in the political class for union with Germany. It wasn't one-sided, and the old belief that the Austrians were the first to suffer under the Nazis has now been changed to realize that, in fact, the Austrians had cooperated very, very actively, not only in the events after 1939, but even in the Anschluss itself. And Czechoslovakia, one of the few effective, successful democracies that actually emerged from the empires of the First World War. A state and functioning democracy with the 10th largest economy in the world in 1937, was forced to accept a dictator, Adolf Hitler, who dismembered the state following the signing of the 1938 Munich Pact. Democracy had succeeded in Czechoslovakia, but this dynamic and successful republic was undone by its own German citizens and its allies, who abandoned their obligations to appease the Nazis. Peace at any price. The victors were willing to sacrifice Czechoslovakia to ensure that there would be no more war. When Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich with that piece of paper saying peace in our times, most people believed him because they wanted to. They should actually have looked a little bit more deeply to realize that in sacrificing the Czechoslovak Republic, they in fact were sacrificing themselves. The situation then in these states, formed from the old Triple Alliance, was desperate in the interwar years. And that, to some extent, is understandable. But we have to look at the other side as well. Even the victors suffered in ways that they couldn't have imagined after the delirium of victory in November 1918. Britain, in particular, had entered the war as the greatest power probably on earth. We've seen the size of its trade, the power of its navy and merchant marine. We've seen the size of its economy. But during that war, in those 4 years, Britain had suffered the loss of an entire generation of young men and devastating economic damage. It had lost much of its world trade. The United States had taken much of it before 1917. The destruction of the British economy in terms of the ability to produce things that people wanted, even if they could afford to buy them, had largely been compromised. So the end of World War I did not bring the comfort and success that was expected after victory. Instead, Britain witnessed unemployment, economic dislocation, and a level of labor unrest that paralleled the situation among the vanquished. In 1926, a general strike in which the Trade Union Congress effectively closed down the nation polarized British society and rekindled class antagonisms on a level that hadn't been seen since the early days of the Industrial Revolution. Middle-class and upper-class volunteers drove trams and buses. They worked to break the strike. They reviled the strikers as traitors, despite the fact that these same strikers had made the sacrifice in the trenches just a decade before to give those middle and upper class individuals the security and the freedom they were then enjoying. The strikers saw those they called toff scabs as trying to take away the only weapon they had to protect their livelihoods and to protect their families, and that was their labor. They saw the mine owners close pits and throw them into unemployment or demand cruel wage concessions to keep working that would have reduced their wage right back to that level of David Ricardo and mere subsistence. The sense of a united nation forged during the war had completely disintegrated into two nations as described by Disraeli and Sybil yet again. The Socialist Labour Party had benefited greatly from these tensions. The Labour Party eclipsed the middle-class Liberals to become the largest party in Britain, winning the 1929 election, indicating again the extreme polarization between the Socialist Labour Party and the conservative, mildly right-wing party on the right. But ominously, a British fascist party began to grow on the right as well under Sir Oswald Mosley, a party of black shirts that was in fact committed to doing the same sorts of things in Britain that Hitler was doing in Germany. Fortunately, the traditions of British democracy remained strong, and democracy survived. As in Britain, France was not initially affected by the Great Depression to the same degree, at least not to the same degree as its neighbors. Its economy was wonderfully balanced and had survived the war years remarkably well, given the level of destruction in France and also given the debt that the French government had necessarily assumed. However, by 1932, the world depression had taken its toll, and the post-war equilibrium evaporated. With a great many parties on the right and a great many parties on the left, all seeking unworkable coalitions, political chaos ensued. There were 6 governments in just 18 months in the period 1932-1933. Then the left-wing parties became more and more stridently Marxist in response to the Depression and the example set by the rise of the Soviet socialist state and the socialist parties that were becoming more radical in almost every European country. But equally, the French fascist party, the Axioms françaises, gained supporters from all classes. This led to the February 1934 riots, which appeared as the initial stage of a coup by the fascists and threatened, very really, to parallel the success of the German and Italian right. The left, however, saved France. The left responded in a way that would have been impossible in Germany. The French left-wing parties of all stripes in 1936 formed under Léon Blum a popular front of socialists and communists in order to ensure there would not be a rightist, a fascist victory. Moreover, not only did they keep the right on the margins of French political life, they also provided France with good, responsible government, recovering for democracy those workers who had flirted with fascism or those who wished to effect a violent Bolshevik coup d'etat. Of course, the Axioms françaises and the right would get their own under Vichy, and it would wreak their own level of punishment on those that they thought had betrayed them. But before the Second World War, France remained a democratic state, and there is a good deal of statesmanship to be thanked for this. Other states in Europe fell to royal or fascist dictatorships as well, often from fear again of the success of the communist insurrections in Germany and Hungary, or to try and solve internal, usually national, divisions. Take, for example, Yugoslavia, which was formed in 1918 by amalgamating the old Kingdom of Serbia with Croatia and Slovenia, taken from Austria-Hungary. It didn't get the name of Yugoslavia until 1929, but nevertheless, the state was essentially there. The king decreed a royal dictatorship to control the nationalist hatreds between the Serbs and the Croats. In Romania, the fascist Iron Guard arose. Although King Carol attempted to impose a royal dictatorship, the Iron Guard proved too powerful, and he was forced to abdicate in 1940 and flee his homeland with his mistress, Magda Lupescu. Theirs, of course, is one of the many romantic stories that reflected the personal and the painfully human price that Europeans of all ranks, including kings, were forced to pay as a consequence of the tumultuous instability of their times. The Iron Guard then turned Romania into a Nazi puppet state, and the Romanians would fight with the Germans. Nationalism divided Bulgaria, and fascism emerged, driving King Boris also to decree a royal dictatorship, but one again with very close ties to the fascist power, as the king was married to an Italian princess, and Mussolini and the King of Italy had great sympathy with the position of that Balkan nation. Poland, threatened by Russia from the east, and with whom it had fought a war in 1919 to 1921, and threatened from Germany from the west, fell to a military leader, Marshal Pilsudski. Spain, after an unspeakably horrible, terrible civil war of 1936 to 1939, between the Republicans on the left, supported by the Soviet Union, and the fascists supported by Germany and Italy, witnessed a fascist victory under General Francisco Franco, who also later restored the monarchy, but again, as in Hungary, with no king. Europe between the wars, then, was hardly a celebration of democracy. It was hardly a place that seemed to represent the hope that a war had been fought to make the world safe for democracy. It seemed to many then that those sacrifices of World War I were in vain, especially for the citizens who had to live through that very difficult time and only wait for the next cataclysm to arise, as it did on the 3rd of September, 1939.